Inflation down has been a big campaign promise of President-elect Donald Trump. Valley News Team's Tiffany Ackerman spoke with local economists today to hear what they think of his plan.
This is a magnificent victory for the American people that will allow us to make America great again.
President-elect Trump has multiple plans and policies he intends to implement to reduce prices and provide tax cuts. But Riaz Aziz, the instructor of economics at the Concordia College in Moorhead, says the president can only do so much to affect the prices of things.
It is not the person or the persons who are in charge of the legislative or the executive branch that directly drives inflation, but it is consumer demand and supply of the goods and services that ultimately determines the level of inflation.
And he says any policy changes often take a while to make an impact.
But in terms of policies established by the executive and the legislative branch, those can take anywhere from 6 months, year and a half, 2 years to actually see the impact.
Although Trump says he plans to reduce the cost of things, many economists say his plan for tariffs can actually drive prices up.
The broader the implementation, the more the negative impacts on growth and the positive impact on inflation.
The Federal Reserve has a goal of getting inflation to about 2%. The latest number from the Labor Department have it sitting at 2.4%. In Moorhead, Tiffany Ackerman, Valley News Live.
The Economist added right now there is no way to fully know what the economic impact of a Trump administration will be.
But they did say the U.S. economic growth has responded in a positive way during the first Trump administration up until the pandemic.